So in 2016, a movie came out entitled Hidden Figures. And it's based on a true story about these three remarkable women, African American women, who are mathematicians who've been hired by NASA during the period of segregation in the United States. They've been hired because they're able to do math solutions, provide math solutions for equations that computers could not provide during that time. And so these brilliant women were really hiding behind the scenes, giving other people the information that they needed for NASA to do their work, to be able to make significant contributions in the field of aerospace science. And in all of that, even though they're brilliant, wonderful people, they are treated like second-class citizens because of their race. They're underestimated. They're not appreciated. And perhaps the saddest part of all is that their story kind of got lost. They never got the credit that they were due. And so this movie is called Hidden Figures. This is just my interpretation, but I think the idea is that it's based on two different things. It's kind of a play on words, that it's hidden figures because they're mathematicians looking for these figures, trying to solve them, but also these ladies, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, they remain hidden figures for decades because their story isn't told. They're kind of hidden in the background. And when we get exposed to these true stories, it kind of gives us pause to consider how historical record is preserved, how accurately it's preserved. But it also gives me pause, and probably all of us here, on this All Saints' Day, as we think about remarkable people in our lives who their names aren't written anywhere in history books. If you go somewhere out in public and you mention their name, no one else might know who they are. Perhaps our parents or grandparents who have gone before us, or a school teacher or a Sunday school teacher, someone who made a lasting impression in our lives. But their memory is largely lost to humanity. And in those moments when we try to explain to people who never met our saints, when we try to explain to them why they're so special and important to us, sometimes it's hard to put it into words. Because maybe it's because they cut off our crust on our peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And that was a sign and a symbol of how much they loved us. Or they were just always there. And sometimes it's hard to communicate that unless we experience it. And it causes me to think about all of the hidden figures. Perhaps people who have lived in the hills of West Virginia, that have been saints, the caliber of Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King Jr. But they're hidden. Their stories aren't told, even though they lived with sacrifice and generosity and great love. And so for the next 4 weeks, we're going to be looking at these hidden figures and how God used them to do remarkable things, especially today as we remember those in our lives whom we remember who might largely remain hidden figures. Today we're going to be looking at Theodore Weld. And I would be surprised if many of you knew who this individual was. Theodore Weld was born in 1803 in Connecticut. And at the age of 14, he took over his family's farm. because he wanted to save up enough money to go to college and pay his tuition. But along the way, he started having some vision loss, and he went to the doctor, and basically the doctor said that there was not a whole lot that they could do for him, that a life in education probably wasn't in his future. But for some reason, the doctor thought it would be a good idea for Theodore Weld to travel. And so, living in the Northeast, he began to travel throughout the United States, and he went into the South and witnessed enslavement firsthand. He saw the terrors of slavery in America. And it just so happened that Theodore Weld not only lived during this period of slavery in the United States, but he also lived during something that we call the Great Awakening. And one evening, he heard the preaching of a figure named Charles Finney, who was a Wesleyan preacher. And he was converted under Finney's preaching and kind of became a disciple, following him, listening to him. And these two events in his life coupled together of becoming a Christian and also being exposed to slavery really compelled him to do something about the injustices that he had witnessed in the South. And so he began speaking out against it. He joined different civic and social groups that were working towards abolishment. And the people around him saw that he was just this incredibly gifted person. Some of his peers described him as a genius. Some of them said that he could speak for 3 hours, holding an audience captive, listening to every word that he would speak. And he did all of this while he also did manual labor for his livelihood, because he believed that part of the problem with slavery in the United States was that people who were in the upper class were not engaged in manual labor. And so he was living out example and also speaking out against the evils and oppression that he saw. And so his peers elected him to be their spokesperson, and for a year he went on tour throughout the United States in 1832. And in 1832, he went around talking about seeing slavery firsthand. In that time, imagine in 1832 how challenging it would be to travel 4,500 miles. And during that time, he gave 236 public addresses. Then in 1939, Theodore Weld and his wife and his sister-in-law published a highly influential book entitled American Slavery as It Was, a testimony of 1,000 witnesses, which ultimately inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Then in 1941, he went to Washington, D.C. to support John Quincy Adams, who was being tried by Congress for reading petitions that were in violation of the gag order. Weld fought against slavery. He fought for abolishment until he saw it happen in 1865 when the 13th Amendment was introduced. And during his career, he was beaten and stoned by angry mobs, earning him the reputation as the most mobbed man in America. But in the later years of his life, he actually lived to be 91 years old. And a significant portion of his life was after the abolition of slavery. And of course, you would imagine as someone who was influential, who was working really kind of behind the scenes and who was causing this great influence in America, you can imagine how often he was called on to be a representative of what had happened. But in 1950, a book entitled Theodore Weld, The Crusader of Freedom, was written. And the author says, Weld would never accept an office of authority or honor in any anti-slavery organization. He refused to speak at anti-slavery conventions or anniversaries, or even to attend them if he could avoid it. He shunned the cities and chose to labor in the country districts where newspapers were few and his activities were seldom reported except by abolition journals. His writings were published anonymously, and he would seldom allow the content of his speeches or his letters from the field to appear in print at all. And so you could say by his own choosing that Theodore Weld was a hidden figure. Now, as we reflect on the gospel lesson today from Luke chapter 19, there's this familiar story that many of us heard in Sunday school as children about Zacchaeus, this chief tax collector. And it's a story that we might not always understand or give it its due acknowledgement in terms of its impact in the overall message of Luke's gospel. Because for the last 10 chapters, Jesus has been traveling. He's been on this journey going towards Jerusalem. And this stop in Jericho where Zacchaeus is living, this is Jesus' last stop. This is the last stretch of his journey before he gets to Jerusalem. And along the way, for those 10 chapters, from Luke chapter 9 to Luke chapter 19, Jesus has encountered lots and lots of people who have started following him on the way. And so when Jesus gets to Jerusalem and he encounters Zacchaeus, we could imagine this caravan of people. They're also traveling to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. So there would have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pilgrims going in this same direction. And it's important to put all of this together, because when Jesus goes to Zacchaeus and he looks at him as Zacchaeus has climbed up this sycamore tree, and he says, "Zacchaeus, come down, I'm going to your house today." It's not explicitly stated, but it's implied that Jesus is going to bring all of these people with him. That he's expecting Zacchaeus to be the host. And it would really work out because he was likely a person of wealth. He probably had a larger than usual home. He had, evidently, he would have had paid servants. He would have been able to foot the bill of all of the food for the banquet that it would have cost to feed Jesus and all of his friends and everyone who have gathered around. The problem was they had this social rule that's not so different from ours. It's kind of like guilt by association. And the idea was, if anybody would have crossed into Zacchaeus' home, they would have been painted with the same brush as him. Zacchaeus was called a tax collector, lumped in as one of the sinners, one of the people who are marginalized and estranged from the community of faith because of various stigmas that they live with. Zacchaeus would have been among that group. And no one would have wanted to go into Zacchaeus' home. No one would have wanted to follow Jesus. And that's why we hear all of this chatter and this mumbling and this groaning whenever Jesus says, "I'm going to your house today." Most of us are probably familiar with the part of the story where Zacchaeus repents because he's been exploiting people financially. He vows that he'll pay 4 times back in restitution, that he'll give half of his possessions to the poor. And obviously, this is an important part of the story. But when Jesus says salvation has come to this house today, it's possible that we could translate the same phrasing, this Greek word soteros, which is where we get salvation. It could also be translated healing and wholeness has come to this house today. Because when Jesus and all of these other people crossed the threshold into Zacchaeus' home, it would have changed the local narrative about this guy. I mean, his generosity, his willingness to do all of these things would have impacted their entire community. It would have been good news. But I think the salvation, the healing, the wholeness that Jesus is talking about is that not only is Zacchaeus going to change, but this community is going to have to change the way that they treat Zacchaeus. And the best way to do that is to bring him into his house, sit him around the table, and celebrate the fact that they are all on the same journey with Jesus together. If we look at the story really closely, we'll see that there's a hidden figure. Someone whose name doesn't get listed in the credits. Someone who we can tell the story without mentioning them at all or that they ever existed. But without their role, it would significantly change the plot. And it's the person. Sometime before, we don't know when, but they planted a sycamore tree. They planted it there, never knowing that there was going to be a conversation between the Jewish Messiah and the chief tax collector in Jericho. This hidden figure planted this tree there, not knowing what good it was going to do, what kind of impact it was going to make, how it would ultimately change the city of Jericho, and how it would become a local legend for centuries. We can tell this story without ever acknowledging that this person existed. And we don't know if they would have been like Theodore Weld or not. We don't know if this hidden figure in this story would have shied away from the spotlight. But both of these stories, this anonymous tree planter and Theodore Weld, have got me thinking about the different virtues of being a hidden figure. A lot of times we think about our lives and especially question our mortality and the meaning of why we're here and whether we're going to be remembered. And I think that's okay. That's normal. That's human. But these hidden figures, they live by this example that who they are is not as important as the work that they've done. And on this All Saints' Day, we often read this passage of Scripture from Hebrews chapter 11 that talks about people from the Old Testament who have lived with great faithfulness. And then at the beginning of the very next chapter, chapter 12, the author says that we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. And this year, as I was preparing this message, for the very first time, I thought about the significance of this phrasing, this imagery of a cloud. It made me think about how most of us probably wouldn't drink cloudy water, or we might be a little bit embarrassed if we, pat our couch and a cloud of dust comes up. It's usually not a good thing. It means that the view is not clear, that there's something indistinguishable hidden in there. And that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about what it means to be a saint. Because being a saint, I think, according to the examples that we've looked at this morning, focus more about pointing to our witness than to our legacy. Giving more time and attention to what God has called us to do than if we will be the ones who are remembered. And maybe we won't be remembered. Maybe we won't be remembered in the way that we like to think or the way that we hope we will. But that's okay. Because even though there are countless people who have lived as saints who are not remembered today, what still exists is their witness. And that great cloud of witness surrounds us. And as followers of Jesus, that's our invitation and calling too, to not worry so much about our legacy, but to make sure that we're contributing to this witness. So that when people, if they remember us at all, they'll remember us because we have been those who have fixed our eyes on Jesus. And the residue of our life would fade into this cloud with all the others, pointing them to the majesty of Christ. This is my prayer for all of us on this All Saints Sunday, that we might embrace this virtue of being hidden figures, that we might be okay and embrace being lost behind our witness. Will you bow your heads with me as we pray?